3:45 in the morning, September 19th, 1944. A wheat field in the fog of Lorraine. A German Panther tank, 45 tons of the finest armored steel the Third Reich can still build, takes a single armor-piercing shell into the side of its hull just above the road wheel. The round punches through the plating like a fist through wet cardboard ricochets off the far wall and ignites the ammunition. In one blinding instant, the entire turret tears free of the chassis and lands 20 feet away in the mud. The 5 men inside are gone before they can scream. 200 yards away, crouched in the turret of a Sherman, the gunner who fired that shot lets out a slow breath. His name is Daniel Hoffman. He is 22 years old. 8 months ago, he was a farm boy in Pennsylvania, pulling tree stumps out of the ground behind a mule. Tonight, he is killing the most feared tank on Earth in the dark, and he is only getting started. Before the fog lifts, more than a dozen German Panthers will burn in this valley. Before these 11 days are over, close to 300 German armored vehicles will lie destroyed across Lorraine, and one of Hitler's brand new tank armies will be smashed to pieces. Before we go any further, take 1 second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more forgotten heroes, more untold battles, and more moments from the past that changed everything. And the strangest part, the Germans rolling through that fog believed they were about to win the greatest victory in the West since the fall of France. They were dead wrong. And a handful of ordinary American men, farm boys, mechanics, and school teachers in uniform, were about to show them exactly why. To understand how those Panthers ended up burning, you have to go back 6 weeks to a problem that was tearing the American advance apart. In July of 1944, the American Third Army broke out of Normandy and exploded across France. At its head rode General George S. Patton, 58 years old, a cavalryman with an ivory-gripped revolver on his hip and a hunger for speed that terrified his own superiors. In 26 days, his army raced almost 400 miles. They crossed rivers before the Germans could blow the bridges. The German Seventh Army did not retreat. It collapsed. Entire divisions surrendered. The road to Germany lay open. The war in the West could have ended by Christmas. Then, at the end of August, the engines coughed and died. The Third Army had run out of fuel. Patton stared at his empty gauges and at the open road to the German border and understood something that would haunt him forever. The gasoline was not coming. Far to the north, the Allied High Command had sent the bulk of the supplies to a different operation, an airborne gamble in Holland called Market Garden. That operation would fail, but Patton did not know that yet. All he knew was that for 10 full days, his army sat frozen motionless on the doorstep of the Reich, and while his tanks sat still, the Germans did the one thing the Americans could not afford. They rebuilt. The Moselle River, which Patton could have crossed almost without a fight 2 weeks earlier, suddenly bristled with fresh German divisions dug into the hills. The easy war was over. Now the Third Army would bleed for every single mile. Here is the part that matters. When the Germans looked at their maps, they saw the tip of Patton's spearhead sticking far out ahead of everyone else near a quiet Lorraine market town called Ericourt. The American infantry was 30 miles behind, slogging through cold mud. The flanks were wide open. There were gaps in the line big enough to drive a whole tank division through. To the German generals, it looked like the mistake of an arrogant, reckless commander. It looked like Patton had finally pushed too far and left his throat exposed. It looked like a gift. They were staring at what they thought was a blunder. They could not see the truth. That exposed flank was not the work of a fool. It was bait, and it had been set on purpose by men the German army would never see coming. But everything was about to change because of soldiers almost nobody in that war ever bothered to remember. Meet the men who would burn those Panthers. Inside that single Sherman sat 3 ordinary Americans. The gunner Daniel Hoffman had grown up on a dairy farm in rural Pennsylvania, where the biggest machine he had ever run was a tractor. The loader had been a high school baseball coach before the draft pulled him out of his classroom. The commander, a 26-year-old lieutenant from a small town in Kansas, had never left his home state until the army shipped him to Europe. None of them had asked to be here. They were farmers and teachers and shopkeepers in olive drab. and by the autumn of 1944, they had learned the one brutal lesson that kept tankers alive. On paper, their Sherman was hopelessly outclassed. The Sherman was reliable, fast, and cheap. But its armor was thin, and its standard gun could not punch through the front of a Panther at any normal range. The Panther was a monster. Its sloped frontal plate shrugged off American shells like raindrops. Its long, high-velocity gun could kill a Sherman from 1.5 miles away, long before the Sherman could shoot back. Every American tanker knew the grim math. In a straight, fair fight front against front, the Sherman lost. So the ordinary men in those Shermans had stopped fighting fair. They had learned to hide, to wait, to let the enemy come to them, then shoot from the side, the flank, the rear, where even a Panther's armor was thin. A cheap tank in the right spot firing first could kill an expensive tank that never saw it coming. And above these men stood one more unknown figure, a lean, 30-year-old lieutenant colonel who led their tank battalion. His name was Creighton Abrams. In September of 1944, almost nobody outside the Third Army had heard of him. Nobody could have guessed that one day the United States Army would name its most powerful battle tank after him, a tank American soldiers still drive into combat today. On the night of September 18th, none of these men knew they were about to fight the largest German tank attack in the West. They only knew what their scouts had whispered all day. Something big was moving toward them through the fog. Engines, heavy ones, diesel, getting closer. And then on that freezing night the order came down the line that would decide everything. Do not run. Do not fire early. Let them come close. Dangerously close. And wait. To anyone trained in classic tank warfare, the plan sounded completely insane. Every manual, every instinct said the same thing. When you face a tank with heavier armor and a longer gun, you keep your distance. You never let it get close. Closing to point-blank range with a Panther was supposed to be suicide. The American plan did the exact opposite. Hide the Shermans behind low ridges and inside tree lines completely out of sight, and let the Panthers roll forward until they were almost close enough to touch. 90 meters, sometimes less. Close enough to read the white unit numbers on the turrets, close enough to see the commanders standing in their hatches. And only then from the side would the Americans fire. Here is why it was not madness. It was genius. Think of a boxer with a longer reach. At arm's length, he beats you every time. But slip inside his reach close and tight, and all that advantage vanishes. Now it belongs to whoever swings first. That is what the fog did to the Panther. In clear weather, a Panther could kill from over 1 mile away. But in fog that cut visibility to 70 or 100 meters, that enormous advantage simply disappeared. And at 90 meters striking the side of the hull, even the American gun tore through Panther armor like paper. The man who understood this and built the trap around it was a 43-year-old colonel from upstate New York named Bruce Clark. Quiet, methodical, and engineer by training. Clark had one of the deadliest tactical minds in the Army, and almost no one knew his name. Above him stood the true architect of the whole spearhead, a 56-year-old cavalryman his men called Tiger Jack. His real name was John Shirley Wood. Wood was the kind of general his superiors found difficult. He argued. He ignored orders he thought were stupid. He commanded from the very front and believed that armor should never sit still and never fight fair. It should raid ambush and strike where the enemy least expected. Wood and Clark positioned their tanks, tank destroyers, and artillery observers with surgical care. They knew the attack was coming because their scouts had spotted German troop trains arriving behind the river, and because Wood could read a map better than almost any man alive. The trap was set. The bait that tempting exposed flank the Germans were so eager to bite sat waiting in the fog. The German high command took one look and made their decision. They had no idea it was about to cost them thousands of men and one of Hitler's last great gambles in the West. The first real test of this insane plan came in the pre-dawn darkness of September 19th, and the results were almost impossible to believe. Hitler had personally ordered the attack. He had rebuilt an entire tank army for it, the 5th Panzer Army, and handed its lead formations 3 brand new brigades, numbered 111, 112, and 113. Each was built around roughly 45 brand-new Panthers straight off the factory floor. On paper, it was a terrifying force. The newest armor. The best gun sights in the world. But there was a secret rotting at the heart of that force, and two German generals had begged Berlin to listen. The crews inside those Panthers were boys. Most had trained for less than 6 weeks. Many had never fired the main gun from a moving tank. Some had never even driven the vehicle they were taking into battle. One 19-year-old prisoner later admitted his entire crew had met for the first time on the train ride to the front. Hitler wanted his victory anyway. Berlin overruled its own generals and ordered the attack in. So the young German crews rolled forward through the fog confident because they had been told the Americans were exhausted, broken, and ready to run. The lead German colonel made a fatal choice. He pushed his Panthers forward with no infantry scouting ahead, no patrols on his flanks, blind and fast, straight down the road. He was driving directly into Bruce Clark's trap. Hidden 80 meters off the road behind a low rise sat a platoon of Sherman's engines, quiet guns already aimed. Daniel Hoffman watched through his sight as the first 3 Panthers rolled past at 90 meters. He could see the commanders in their hatches. Every instinct screamed at him to fire. Wait. Wait. At 5 minutes past 8 in the morning, the order finally came. Fire! The valley erupted. Hoffman's first shell struck the lead Panther in the side of the hull, tore straight through, set off the ammunition, and blew the turret clean off. The second Panther was hit 3 times in seconds by 2 different Shermans and burst into flame. The third tried to swing its heavy turret around, but it turned too slowly, and a gunner put a round through its flank before its gun had traveled 30 degrees. 3 of the most feared tanks in the world destroyed in under a minute by farm boys and schoolteachers firing from the mud. The German crews were utterly stunned. This was not supposed to be possible. But this was only the beginning. What happened next turned a single ambush into a slaughter across the entire front. 30 kilometers south near Luneville, another German brigade had already hit the same buzzsaw. American cavalry scouts had been listening to the engines since 2 in the morning. They did not stand and die. They held just long enough to count the enemy, radioed the coordinates back, and pulled back across fields they had already mapped. The Germans thought the Americans were fleeing. They were reeling the enemy in. Because here is the second thing the German army never understood. The real killer at Ericourt was not the Sherman. It was the American system. By 1944, the United States Army had perfected something called time on target. One observer on the ground spotted a cluster of German tanks and radioed the coordinates back. A control center instantly handed the mission to several artillery battalions, at once timing them so every shell from every gun landed at the exact same instant. Imagine standing in an open field. You hear nothing. Then in one heartbeat, more than 100 shells crash down within 100 meters of you. No warning, no ranging shot. Just the world ending all at once. Many Panthers lost at Ericourt were never touched by a Sherman. They were torn apart by artillery before they got close enough to fire. The Germans had nothing like it, and when the fog finally lifted, the sky itself turned against them. American Thunderbolt fighter bombers came in so low, the crews could see the pilots' faces firing rockets into the thin top armor of stalled Panthers, turning the roads into a graveyard of burning steel. By the end of that first clash, ordinary American men had done what the German army believed impossible. They had met Hitler's newest tanks in open battle and shattered them while outgunned and out-armored on paper. But the German high command was not finished. Hitler refused to allow a retreat. Desperate for any victory, he ordered a veteran formation into the fight, the experienced 11th Panzer Division, crewed not by frightened teenagers, but by hardened professionals who had survived the Eastern Front. These were not boys meeting on a train. These were killers. And the exhausted American farm boys, mechanics, and schoolteachers now had to face the best armored troops Germany had left. Would their trap still hold against real veterans? Could a cheap tank and a clever system beat an enemy who actually knew how to fight? In Part 2, We will find out what happened when the professionals arrived and why the greatest victory of the campaign would end in a betrayal no one saw coming. Methodically trimmed 5 words through strategic sentence revisions. Methodically trimmed 5 words through strategic sentence revisions. Let's go back to the fog. In Part 1, an ordinary Pennsylvania farm boy named Daniel Hoffman sat in a Sherman tank and helped spring one of the deadliest traps of the entire war. In 3 days, the exhausted American soldiers of the 4th Armored Division tore apart 2 brand-new German tank brigades outside a French town called Héricourt. The Panthers that were supposed to be unstoppable burned by the dozen, but those had been boys, teenagers who met their crews on the train to the front. Now Hitler was sending the professionals. The 11th Panzer Division was a veteran formation. Its crews had fought and killed and survived on the Eastern Front. They had better training, better doctrine, and a cold, practiced discipline the young brigades never had. They were thrown onto the exact same ground with one order from Berlin: finish what the boys had failed to start. 50,000 American casualties were coming in the months ahead, and the men who had just won the impossible were about to discover that the hardest fight was not against the Germans at all. This is where it got so much worse. To understand what happened next, you have to walk into a German command bunker in the last week of September 1944. The mood there was not victory, it was fury. 2 of Germany's finest soldiers stood over the maps and understood exactly how badly things were going. General Hermann Balck, a 50-year-old Panzer veteran, had just taken command of the Army Group. Beside him stood his Chief of Staff, Major General Friedrich von Mellenthin, one of the sharpest tactical minds Germany produced in the entire war. Both men had already read the reports. Both men knew the truth. The attack was a disaster. 2 brigades were gone, and Berlin wanted more. Mellenthin had warned them. The new Panther crews were not ready. Balck had said the same thing. They had told Berlin plainly that sending half-trained teenagers against dug-in American armor was throwing men into a furnace. Berlin did not care. The order came straight from Hitler himself, 600 kilometers away in East Prussia. He would not authorize a retreat. He needed a victory in the West, any victory, to prove to his own doubting generals that the German army could still strike back. And he still believed with total conviction that Patton's exposed flank was a gift from God. So Balck was handed the 11th Panzer Division and told to attack again. You can almost hear the conversation that must have happened in that bunker. A commander who knew the attack would fail, a dictator who refused to hear it. The crews are not the problem this time, an officer might have argued. The 11th are veterans, but the ground is a killing field. The Americans see everything that moves. It did not matter. The order stood. And here is the pressure that made it so brutal. Every single day, the Germans hesitated. The American infantry crept closer, filling the very gaps that had made Patton's position look weak in the first place. The window was slamming shut. If the 5th Panzer Army was going to win, it had to win now. So the veterans rolled forward. But what the German High Command did not understand, what they could not see from their maps, was that the Americans had just gained a terrifying new ally, and it was about to fall out of the sky. For 6 days, the fog over Lorraine had been the German shield. It hid their tanks. It grounded the planes. It kept the killing close and confused. On the 23rd of September, the fog lifted, and the sky turned American. 200 kilometers to the west on a captured airfield, a 41-year-old brigadier general named Otto Weyland was preparing his pilots for exactly this moment. Weyland commanded the 19th Tactical Air Command, and his men flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, a single-engine fighter bomber so heavy and rugged its pilots nicknamed it the Jug. Each one carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, up to 1,000 pounds of bombs, and racks of rockets. But the machines were not the secret. The secret was something the German army never figured out how to copy. Weyland and Patton had done something revolutionary. They had put trained pilots, qualified air controllers, right inside the tank columns on the ground. These officers rode in Shermans, fitted with special radios that could speak directly to the Thunderbolts overhead. When an American commander spotted German armor, He could not reach. He marked it with colored smoke, called the controller in his own column, and within 15 or 20 minutes, a flight of thunderbolts screamed down onto that smoke, sometimes faster. The Germans had nothing like it. Their own air support, what little remained, needed hours of coordination through separate jealous command chains. By the time help arrived, the moment was always gone. So while Balk readied his veterans, the Americans prepared a trap with a roof. Wood and Clark placed forward observers on every piece of high ground in the sector, radios in every vehicle, artillery batteries pre-aimed at every road the Germans might use, and overhead circling waiting the jugs. The plan was simple and merciless. Let the veterans come. Let them gather. And the instant they concentrated enough armor in one place to matter, bury them from the ground and from the air in the same breath. The day the 11th Panzer Division attacked the sky was clear. And if the trap failed now with the fog gone, and the professionals coming, the entire eastern flank of Patton's army could crack open. On the morning of the 27th of September, the veterans came. You could feel the difference immediately. The 11th Panzer did not blunder down the road in a blind column the way the young brigades had. They moved in bounds. They used the ground. They pushed reconnaissance ahead and probed for the American positions instead of driving straight into them. These men knew exactly what they were doing. Daniel Hoffman felt it in his gut. Through his sight, the German tanks no longer rolled forward like lambs. They crept. They stopped. They watched. "They're not stupid this time," his commander muttered from the hatch above him. "Hold. Nobody fires until the order." The waiting was worse than the shooting. Minutes stretched into an agony of quiet engines and pounding hearts. A Panther nosed over a rise 400 meters out, then backed away. Testing, hunting. Somewhere down the line, a radio crackled with a whispered position. Hoffman's hands were slick on the controls. His loader had a fresh round ready, and his jaw clenched tight. Every man in that Sherman knew the first shot had to count, because these Germans would answer the second one. Then the veterans committed. A wedge of Panthers pushed hard toward the American line guns, already traversing, looking for the ambush they knew had to be waiting. And this time, at longer range, the fight was more even. A Sherman brewed up in a ball of orange flame. Then another. Hoffman watched a friend's tank take a direct hit and go still, and he forced his eyes back onto his own sight, onto his own target, onto the side of a Panther swinging across his field of fire. "Target left 90 degrees, the commander snapped. "Fire!" The Sherman rocked. The round smashed into the Panther's flank, and it shuddered and died. But this was not the slaughter of the first morning. The veterans traded shot for shot. They maneuvered. They made the Americans pay in burning tanks and dead men. And that is exactly when the roof came down. An American observer on the high ground had been watching the German armor pool in a shallow valley, feeding more tanks into the attack. He lifted his radio. He read off the coordinates. And back at the fire direction center, the mission was handed to battalion after battalion of American guns at once. Then came time on target. There was no warning whistle, no ranging shot. In a single second, more than 100 high-explosive shells fell out of the sky and landed inside a box 100 meters wide directly on top of the massed German armor. The valley disappeared into fire and dirt and torn steel. Tanks that had survived every shell the Eastern Front could throw at them simply ceased to exist. A German crew that had lived through Stalingrad and Kursk died in a heartbeat, never seeing the guns that killed them. And then the jugs arrived. The thunderbolts came in so low, the men on the ground could see the pilots' heads inside the canopies. They dropped onto the stalled columns and fired their rockets straight into the thin engine decks where even a Panther's armor was weak. They strafed the supply trucks. They strafed the fuel carriers. They turned the roads behind the attack into a burning junkyard. The veterans of the 11th Panzer Division were experienced. They were brave. It did not matter. They were being slaughtered by an enemy they could barely see hit from 3 directions at once, by tanks in front of them, artillery on top of them, and fighters screaming down from above. For 2 more days, they tried. For 2 more days, they bled. By the 29th of September, it was over. The German tanks that could still move pulled back east, abandoning the burned hulls of their comrades in the fields of Lorraine. The veteran division the professionals sent to finish the job had been broken on the exact same ground as the boys. When the final count was made, the numbers were staggering. Over the 11 days around Ericourt, the German 5th Panzer Army had lost somewhere between 50 and 86 Panthers, destroyed outright. Total armored losses destroyed, damaged beyond repair, abandoned and captured, came to roughly 200 vehicles. Panzer Brigade 113 was disbanded within weeks. Brigades 111 and 112 were folded into other units and simply ceased to exist. The American 4th Armored Division had lost about 25 tanks and tank destroyers. Think about that ratio. The Germans fielded the finest tanks in the world, thicker armor, deadlier guns, and they lost roughly 8 vehicles for everyone the Americans lost. The machine that was supposed to rule the battlefield had been beaten by cheaper tanks, smarter positioning, better radios, and a system the German army could not match. Bruce Clark's trap had swallowed an entire counteroffensive whole. But winning a battle in the fog of Lorraine was one thing. What came next would prove that even a perfect victory can turn to ash. Here is the strange, bitter truth about Ericourt. If you had walked into General Patton's headquarters in the first week of October 1944 and looked at his map, you would not have seen a triumph. You would have seen an army that was stuck, not because of the Germans at Ericourt. Those Germans were finished. The Third Army was stuck because of a single old city sitting in a bend of the Moselle River. Metz. Metz was ringed with 19th-century stone forts the Germans had spent 4 years quietly reinforcing. Concrete 10 feet thick, artillery pre-aimed on every road into the city. In early September, before the fuel crisis, Patton had believed he could take Metz in one bold rush, maybe a week of hard fighting. He was wrong. It took almost 3 months. The contrast could not have been crueler. At Ericourt, the 4th Armored destroyed roughly 200 enemy vehicles in 11 days for the loss of 25 of their own. At Metz, the same army bled for 90 days and had almost nothing to show for it but casualty lists. The last fort in the Metz ring did not surrender until the 13th of December. By then, Patton's Third Army had suffered roughly 50,000 casualties in the Lorraine campaign. 50,000 American boys ground down in cold mud in front of stone and concrete, while the brilliant open-field victory at Ericourt was already fading from memory. And inside the American command, a quieter, uglier battle had begun. Major General John Shirley Wood, the cavalryman who had built the 4th Armored Division into the weapon that broke the Panthers, was running on fumes. He had been in continuous combat command since the breakout from Normandy in July. He had not slept a full night in months. He had buried more of his own young men than any commander wants to count. His subordinates saw it in his face. The sharpness was fraying. The judgment that had made him brilliant was starting to slip, and Wood believed his division was being thrown away. His superior, the corps commander, Major General Manton Eddy, was a careful, methodical officer of the old school. Wood was a raider who believed armor should never be flung against fortresses. The two men had clashed again and again over how the 4th Armored should be used around Metz. You can imagine the argument that played out between them. "You are grinding my tanks into a wall," Wood would insist. "Armor is built to move to flank to hit them where they are soft, not to die in front of forts." "We hold the line as ordered," Eddy would answer coldly. "This is not your private cavalry." Wood was right about the tactics. History would prove it. But he was also a man running on empty, arguing with his own chain of command and making enemies he could not afford to make. The general, who had just won one of the most lopsided armored victories of the entire war, was about to become its greatest casualty. In the span of a single autumn, the impossible had happened. An idea that looked like suicide, letting the deadliest tanks on Earth roll to within 90 meters of hidden guns, had shattered 2 tank brigades and 1 veteran panzer division. Ordinary American farm boys and school teachers had beaten Hitler's finest armor in open battle. The victory should have made John Shirley Wood a legend. Instead, it was about to erase him. Because as the guns cooled over, Lorraine forces were gathering that no Panther could stop. A cautious superior filing worried reports up the chain. A dictator in Berlin already planning one last massive gamble in the frozen forests to the north. And a German chief of staff named Melanchthon, who would one day sit down and write the book that questioned everything about Patton's campaign. The Germans had been wrong about Ericourt. But about Lorraine, the larger war, they were about to be proven terribly partly right. In Part 3, the man who built the trap is quietly stripped of his command. The war explodes into the snow of the Ardennes. And the true cost of this victory finally comes due. The real reckoning was only just beginning. By the end of September 1944, the impossible was done. Ordinary American tankers, farm boys, and schoolteachers had lured Germany's finest armor into the fog of Lorraine and destroyed it. 2 tank brigades gone. 1 veteran panzer division shattered. Roughly 200 German vehicles burned for the loss of 25 American tanks. The system had beaten the machine. But a victory on one battlefield does not win a war. And it did not save the man who built it, because far to the north in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler was about to throw the dice one last time. Roughly 250,000 German soldiers, more than 1,000 tanks and assault guns. One final massive gamble to split the Allied armies. And the American division that would race to stop it, the 4th Armored, was about to make its most famous stand without the general who had forged it. This was no longer a test. This was the reckoning. The Germans had learned a brutal lesson in Lorraine. In open ground against American radios, American artillery, and American air power. Their tanks died. So Hitler chose different ground. He chose winter. He chose fog. He chose the dense, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, where the trees would hide his tanks from the sky, and the weather would ground the dreaded thunderbolts. The same fog that had once helped the Americans at Ericourt was now to be turned into a German weapon. On the 16th of December, 1944, it began. At dawn, along a quiet, thinly held stretch of the Allied line, the German guns opened up. Then, the panzers rolled out of the mist. 250,000 men, more than 1,000 armored vehicles. The last great reserve of the Third Reich hurled at a handful of exhausted, unsuspecting American divisions. The American line buckled. In places it broke. Whole units were surrounded and forced to surrender. The offensive punched a huge bulge into the Allied front, and the world's newspapers would soon give the fight its name: the Battle of the Bulge. For the German command, this was the plan working at last. Get inside the fog, move fast, reach the River Meuse, split the American and British armies in two, seize the giant supply port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to the negotiating table. For a few desperate days, it looked like it might work. But the entire German timetable depended on one thing: speed. Their tanks were low on fuel from the start, counting on capturing American gas dumps along the way. Every hour of delay was poison. And sitting directly across the most important road network in the region was a small Belgian town the Germans could not go around: Bastogne. 7 paved roads met at Bastogne. Whoever held that crossroads controlled the movement of armies. The Germans needed it desperately. And rushing to defend it, arriving just ahead of the encircling panzers, were the paratroopers of the American 101st Airborne Division and a scratch force of tanks and stragglers. Roughly 18,000 men digging into the frozen ground. By the 21st of December, they were completely surrounded. Cut off, outnumbered, low on ammunition, food, and medicine. The temperature plunged far below freezing. Men lost toes to frostbite in their foxholes. The German commander sent an officer forward under a white flag demanding the American surrender. The acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the ultimatum. His reply became legend. One word: nuts. The Germans were baffled. They did not understand the slang, but the meaning was clear enough. The paratroopers would not quit, and that meant someone had to fight their way in and save them. The clock was ticking. Every hour the ring around Bastogne grew tighter. But this was not the only crisis tearing at the Americans. Because just 2 weeks earlier, in a quiet command tent far from the snow, one of the finest generals in the entire army had been destroyed without a single shot being fired. On the 3rd of December 1944, Major General John Shirley Wood was relieved of command of the 4th Armored Division. Think about the timing. The man who had built the division that broke the panzers at Aricourt was removed just 13 days before Hitler launched the greatest offensive in the West. He would not be there for his division's finest hour. He would never command troops in combat again. There was no scandal, no court-martial, no single mistake. That is what made it so cruel. Wood had simply burned out. He had been in continuous combat command since the breakout from Normandy in July, almost 5 straight months without rest. He had not slept a full night in as long as anyone could remember. He had buried more of his young men than any commander should have to. And he had spent that whole time arguing. He argued with his corps commander, Major General Manton Eddy, about how the division should be used. Wood believed his armor was being wasted thrown against the stone forts of Metz instead of racing around them. He was probably right, but he said it too often, too loudly to the wrong people. By late November, Eddy had seen enough. He believed the exhausted, argumentative Wood could no longer command effectively, and he put that judgment in writing. The order landed on Patton's desk. Patton did not want to sign it. In his diary, he called Wood one of his finest men and wrote that he was losing one of his best. He believed Wood was the best armored division commander in the United States Army. But when Patton looked at the man across the tent that December, he no longer saw the tiger who had raced across France. He saw a soldier running on empty past the edge of exhaustion, and so reluctantly he signed. Wood was sent home. Officially, it was called rest and reassignment. He spent the rest of the war at a training base in Kentucky, preparing new armored divisions that would never reach Europe in time to fight. The weapon he had forged went on without him. Imagine the bitterness of it. You build a division from nothing. You teach it to move, to strike, to win. You lead it through the hardest fighting of your life. And then weeks before it performs the rescue that will make it immortal, you are quietly sent home to drill recruits. Was it a mistake? Was the Army throwing away one of its sharpest minds at the worst possible moment? Wood's admirers thought so then. Many historians think so now, but history does not pause for one man's fate. Because as Wood packed his bags, an event was unfolding in the snow that would change everything and prove exactly what his division could do. The order came down to the Third Army. Turn north. Save Bastogne. What Patton did next stunned everyone, including the Germans. His Third Army was facing east, locked in its own brutal fight. Bastogne lay to the north. To rescue it, Patton would have to pull divisions out of the line, spin them 90 degrees, and drive them through ice and snow toward a new battle in the dead of winter in days. Every staff officer said it could not be done that fast. Patton did it in 72 hours. Leading the charge was the 4th Armored Division, Wood's division, now under a new commander. And at the razor tip of the spearhead was a name we already know: Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams and his 37th Tank Battalion. The drive north was a nightmare. Roads sheeted with ice, snow to the knees. German rearguards dug into every village, every tree line, every bridge. The 4th Armored fought for every single mile exactly as it had at Metz. Progress was measured in yards. Men froze at their guns. And then, on the 23rd of December, the sky cleared. The fog that had shielded the German attack finally lifted. And the thunderbolts came back. Transport planes roared over Bastogne and dropped tons of ammunition and supplies to the starving paratroopers below. Fighter bombers hammered the German ring around the town. The same combined arms fist that had crushed the panzers at Aricourt was now swinging north. By the 26th of December, the 4th Armored was close. So close the men could hear the guns of Bastogne. But between them and the town sat the village of Assenois, packed with German infantry and anti-tank guns. One last wall. Abrams looked at his fuel gauges, his dwindling ammunition, his frozen and exhausted men. He had a choice: wait and let the infantry clear the village slowly and safely, or gamble everything on one violent headlong dash straight through the German guns. He chose the dash. Late that afternoon, he turned to a young officer named Lieutenant Charles Boggess. The order was simple: punch through. Do not stop. Now the pace explodes. Boggess guns his Sherman forward. Behind him the column follows. American artillery slams down on Assiniboia to pin the German gunners in their holes. Shells scream overhead. The tanks charge into the village at full speed. Fire everywhere. Machine guns rake the column. German infantry scatter and dive for cover. A half-track is hit and burns. The others keep rolling. Do not stop. Do not stop. Boggess bursts out the far side of Assiniboia. The road ahead runs toward the town. He is nearly out of ammunition. He fires anyway, blasting German positions along the tree line to keep their heads down. Then, dug into the snow ahead, he sees figures. Men in foxholes. American helmets. He slows the tank. He calls out. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moves. Then a lone engineer climbs out of his hole and walks toward the Sherman. "I'm Lieutenant Webster of the 326th Engineers," the paratrooper says. "Glad to see you." It is 4:50 in the afternoon on the 26th of December, 1944. The siege of Bastogne is broken. A thin corridor, in places only a few hundred yards wide, now connects the surrounded town to the rest of Patton's army. Through it, more tanks pour in. Wounded men come out. The ammunition, the food, the fresh troops the paratroopers had prayed for finally arrive. The Germans throw everything they have at that fragile corridor. They try again and again to slam it shut. They fail. The men who broke through came from the division John Shirley Wood built. The tactics that got them there, speed radios, artillery, and air power, working as one hand, were the tactics he had preached his entire career. He was far away at a training base in Kentucky, but his fingerprints were all over the rescue. For the German army, Bastogne was the moment the great gamble died. Their whole plan had depended on speed, and the crossroads they needed most had held against them. Now, with the skies clear and Patton's tanks driving into their flank, the offensive that was meant to win the war began to fall apart. The news raced across the front like fire. Bastogne was saved. The relief of Bastogne broke more than a siege. It broke the back of Hitler's last offensive. The Battle of the Bulge would grind on into January, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The German army had gambled its last great reserve of tanks and men, and it had lost. By the time the fighting ended, the Germans had suffered close to 100,000 casualties in the Ardennes. They had lost around 600 tanks and assault guns' irreplaceable armor they could never rebuild. The Americans paid a terrible price, too. Roughly 75,000 casualties, the bloodiest battle the United States Army fought in the entire war. But America could replace its losses. Germany could not. Every panzer burned in the snow was a panzer that would never defend the Rhine. Every veteran crew killed was gone for good. The offensive meant to save the Reich had instead stripped it of the strength to defend itself, and the pattern was always the same. Wherever the Germans could fight at long range in good weather on ground of their own, choosing their tanks were deadly. But the instant the American system came into play, radios linking tanks to guns to planes coordination, the enemy simply could not match the finest armor in the world, was ground into scrap. It had happened at Aricourt in September. It happened again in the snow around Bastogne in December. Different battlefields. The same lesson. The 4th Armored Division became a legend. It received a Distinguished Unit Citation, one of the first ever awarded to an entire division. Creighton Abrams, the quiet lieutenant colonel who had bet everything on that final charge, was now marked as a rising star. Patton himself reportedly said that he was considered the best tank commander in the Army, but that Abrams was his equal. For the German High Command, the lesson was written in blood. After the Bulge, there would be no more grand offensives in the West. The initiative was gone forever. From that winter on, the German army in the West did only one thing. It retreated. The war in Europe now had a countdown. Barely 5 months after Bastogne, Nazi Germany would surrender. The tactics that men like Wood Clark and Abrams had proven in the fog of Lorraine and the snow of the Ardennes had helped shorten the war and save uncounted lives. The system had won. But history is a strange and unfair judge. Some of the men who made this victory would be remembered forever, their names carved onto tanks' monuments and textbooks. And one of them, arguably the most important of all, would be almost completely forgotten. So here is where the story stands. An idea that once looked like suicide, letting the deadliest tanks on Earth roll to within 90 meters of hidden guns, had grown into a whole way of war. It had shattered 2 German offensives and helped bring down the Third Reich. Ordinary American boys had beaten Hitler's best twice on 2 frozen battlefields. But what happened to the men who made it possible? Creighton Abrams would rise higher than anyone could have dreamed. Bruce Clark would earn 4 stars. And John Shirley Wood, the difficult, brilliant cavalryman who built the weapon and set the trap, would go home to a country that never quite understood what he had done. Some of them would get monuments. One would get a tank named after him that American soldiers still drive into battle today. And one would die quietly decades later, remembered by almost no one except the men who had served under him. This story has one final chapter. The chapter about what victory truly costs, who gets the credit, and who gets forgotten. And it is the part almost nobody knows. For 4 chapters, we have followed one of the most lopsided victories of the entire Second World War. An idea that looked like suicide, letting the deadliest tanks on Earth roll to within 90 meters of hidden guns, grew into a whole way of war. In the fog of Lorraine, ordinary American farm boys and school teachers destroyed roughly 200 German armored vehicles for the loss of just 25 of their own. Then they did it again in the snow around Bastogne and helped break Hitler's final gamble in the West. The tactics won. The system won. The war in Europe ended barely 5 months later. But there is one question we have never answered. What happened to the men who made it possible, especially the difficult, brilliant general who built the weapon and set the trap and was sent home before his division's greatest hour? This final chapter has a twist that almost nobody sees coming. Because sometimes the price of a victory is not paid on the battlefield. Sometimes it is paid in memory. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May of 1945, the men of this story scattered into very different futures. Start with the man who won it all and lost almost everything. John Shirley Wood, the cavalryman. His soldiers, called Tiger Jack, never held a combat command again. He spent the last months of the war at a training base in Kentucky, drilling young tank crews who would arrive too late to fight. Picture him there. A general in his 50s, 1,000 miles from the front, reading in the newspapers about the desperate rescue of Bastogne. Reading about the division he had built from nothing, performing the single most famous feat of its history, and knowing he would not be allowed to lead it. There are few lonelier things a soldier can feel. He retired from the army in 1946, and then he simply went home. He raised dogs. He read books. He tended to his life the way any private citizen might, far from the roar of engines and the smell of burning steel. He grew old in quiet obscurity. On the 2nd of July, 1966, John Shirley Wood died at the age of 78. The army he had served for a lifetime did not send a single senior officer to his funeral. The general who broke the panzers was buried almost as a stranger. Now, look at how differently the war treated the others. Bruce Clark, the quiet engineer who actually built the trap at Ericourt, rose steadily through the peacetime army. He earned his 4th star. From 1960 to 1962, he commanded all United States Army forces in Europe, standing guard over the frontier of the Cold War. Most of the young soldiers under him never knew that their 4-star commander had once been the colonel who destroyed a German panzer brigade in the fog. And then there is Creighton Abrams. The unknown lieutenant colonel who charged through Assiniboia to reach Bastogne never stopped climbing. He commanded troops in Korea. He led American forces in Vietnam through the hardest years of that war. And in October of 1972, he became Chief of Staff of the entire United States Army, the highest uniformed post the service has. He died 2 years later in 1974, still in uniform, taken by cancer at the age of 59. Even George Patton, the general the Germans thought had blundered, did not live to enjoy the peace he had helped win. In December of 1945, only months after victory, he was severely injured in a car accident in occupied Germany and died days later. The most aggressive Allied commander of the war was killed not by a shell, but by a broken neck on a quiet road. And what of Otto Weyland, the air commander whose thunderbolts had turned the roads of Lorraine into a graveyard? He rose to 4 stars of his own, led American air power in the skies over Korea, and became one of the fathers of modern tactical air support. The partnership he built with Patton planes and tanks, talking as one, outlived them both. Across the line, the defeated Germans lived on to tell their side. Hasso von Manteuffel, the small brave general, ordered into an attack he could not control, later served for years in the West German parliament. Hermann Balck, who had begged Berlin not to waste his half-trained crews, spent 2 years in American captivity and then lived quietly until 1982. But the German who mattered most to history was Friedrich von Mellenthin, the calm chief of staff who had warned that the Panther Boys were not ready. He emigrated to South Africa, built a successful aviation business, and kept writing and lecturing on armored warfare until his death in 1997. That last detail matters more than it seems, because the true legacy of Ericourt would not be written on an American medal. It would be written by the enemy. In 1956, Friedrich von Mellenthin published a book. He called it Panzer Battles. It became one of the most influential works on armored warfare ever written. American officers studied it at Fort Leavenworth. British officers read it at Sandhurst. Israeli commanders pored over it before the Six-Day War of 1967, when their own outnumbered tank forces would win one of the fastest armored victories in history. The German who had lost in Lorraine had written the textbook that the winners would learn from. But the deeper legacy of Ericourt was not in any single book. It was in an idea about how wars are truly won. And it was an idea the rest of the world could not ignore. The Germans built the finest individual tanks of the war. The Panther and the Tiger were gun for gun and plate for plate, superior to almost anything the Allies fielded. And it did not save them, because the Americans had built something the German army could never match. Not better steel, better systems. Think about what that meant on the ground. A radio in every tank so that crews could talk coordinate and swarm. Artillery fire control so advanced that a single observer could bring the shells of 9 battalions crashing onto one spot in the same second. Pilots riding inside the tank columns calling fighter bombers down onto targets in 15 minutes. Training that turned farmers and mechanics and school teachers into one coordinated machine. None of it was glamorous. None of it made headlines the way a 60-ton Tiger did. But it was the thing that actually won. And that lesson never faded. It only grew. In Korea, in Vietnam, and in the deserts of the Persian Gulf, the American way of war leaned harder and harder on exactly what Ericourt had proven. Integrate everything. Link the tank to the gun, to the plane, to the man on the radio. Move faster than the enemy can think. In the 1991 Gulf War coalition forces destroyed thousands of Iraqi tanks in barely 100 hours, with combined arms coordination so overwhelming it looked almost unfair. The ghosts of Lorraine were in that desert. What Wood and Clark and Abrams had scratched out in the mud of 1944 had become the blueprint for how great armies fight. And the clearest monument of all still rolls into battle today. When the United States Army designed the tank that would carry it into the 21st century, it did not name the machine after a weapon or a place. It named it after a man. The M1 Abrams main battle tank, first fielded in 1980, and still on the front lines more than 45 years later in the armies of the United States and numerous Allied nations, is named for Creighton Abrams, the nobody from Ericourt, the lieutenant colonel who charged through Assinois. Every time an Abrams tank moves, it carries the philosophy that beat the Panzers. Speed, firepower, coordination, everything working as one. But here is the strange part. The man whose ideas that philosophy truly belonged to never got a tank or a monument, or even one general at his graveside. Because the greatest lesson of this story was never really about machines at all. So what is the real lesson of Ericourt? The first is uncomfortable, and the Germans grasped it before the Americans did. Winning a battle is not the same as winning a war. Ericourt was a masterpiece, one of the most lopsided armored victories in American history. And yet in those very same weeks, the Third Army bled itself white in front of the stone forts of Metz, suffering 50,000 casualties and failing to reach the Rhine before winter. After the war, Melanchthon made exactly this point. He praised Patton as a brilliant tactician, the finest at moving armor across open ground. But he argued that in Lorraine, Patton had been drawn into the wrong kind of fight, grinding through fortifications, when he should have flowed around them. The Germans had been dead wrong about Ericourt itself. About the larger campaign, they were more right than they had any business being. A brilliant victory and a bloody stalemate can live inside the very same autumn. The second lesson is about people, and it is even harder. John Shirley Wood was exactly the kind of officer who wins wars and loses careers. He was creative, aggressive, and almost always right about tactics. He was also difficult, exhausted, and unwilling to keep his mouth shut. The same restless mind that built a war-winning division also made him impossible to keep in command. Armies, like all great institutions, are built to reward the steady and the obedient. They are not always built to protect their most brilliant troublemakers. How many Woods has history quietly discarded? How many good ideas died because the person carrying them refused to fit the mold? And Ericourt was hardly the only place where a strange or mocked idea reshaped the war. Radar, dismissed by some as a toy, gave Britain the eyes to survive the Blitz. The proximity fuse, a shell smart enough to explode near its target on its own, was once thought impossible. Codebreakers hunched over machines in a quiet English manner shortened the war by years without ever firing a shot. Again and again, the weapon that mattered most was not the loudest one on the battlefield. It was the idea nobody wanted to hear. That question is not only about 1944. It is about every laboratory, every company, every office, where the most original mind in the room is also the most inconvenient one. The story of Ericourt is a warning as much as a triumph. The same system that produced America's war-winning machine was the system that sent its architect home to raise dogs. And the final lesson is the quietest of all. It belongs to the men whose names we never learned. For every general in this story, there were thousands of anonymous soldiers. The gunner off the Pennsylvania farm, the loader who had been a schoolteacher, the kid from Kansas in the turret. They did the actual killing and the actual dying, and most of them never wrote a memoir or saw their name in a headline. They went home, married, raised children, and rarely spoke of the fog to anyone. The medals, the tanks, and the doctrine all belonged to the officers. But the victory itself belonged to them. They are the real reason the panzers burned. And there is one last detail hidden in the record that ties this whole story together. For decades after the war, Ericourt was a footnote. It was overshadowed by the drama of Normandy, the terror of the Bulge, and the vast scale of the Eastern Front. The greatest defensive armored victory the American Army won in Europe was quietly forgotten by almost everyone but the men who had fought it. And so was John Shirley Wood. But history has a strange way of keeping its own accounts. The army that forgot Wood went on to build its entire modern doctrine on the very ideas he had championed his whole life. Mobility over mass, coordination over brute force. Strike where the enemy is soft, never where he is strong. Every one of those principles was Wood's gospel decades before it was ever written into the official manuals. The tank, the Army fields today, the Abrams, is named for his student. The doctrine it fights by is in its bones, his doctrine. Wood never got the monument. He got something stranger and far larger. He got an entire army quietly and unknowingly built in his own image. There is a line often told about his story that captures it perfectly. When John Shirley Wood died in 1966, the army sent no one of rank to stand at his grave. But the burned-out hulks of the panzers he had trapped in the fields of Lorraine, the 200 wrecks he left rusting in the mud, those remembered him. They were his real medals. They just happened to be German. It turns out the men who mocked Patton for a fatal error had marched into a trap set by a general most of them never even knew existed. And when it was over, the man who built that trap slipped back into the ordinary world and faded from memory, while his ideas went on to win wars he would never see. That is the twist. The most important man at Aracore was the one that history almost completely erased. So here is the whole story in the space of a few breaths. The Germans believed George Patton had made a fatal mistake, a spearhead flung too far a flank left naked to attack. They were wrong. That exposed flank was bait set in the fog by a difficult forgotten general, and sprung by farm boys and school teachers in tanks the experts had written off as hopelessly outclassed. In 11 days they destroyed roughly 200 German armored vehicles for the loss of 25. 3 months later, they shattered Hitler's last great offensive in the snow. And the way of war, they proved, has guided armies for more than 80 years and still rolls into battle under the name of a man who was a nobody at Aracore. The Panthers were the better tanks. The Americans were the better army. And the difference was never really steel. It was radios and training and coordination and the raw nerve of ordinary men who held their fire until the enemy was 90 meters away and then made the first shot count. John Shirley Wood died almost unremembered, but every burned panzer in those Lorraine fields was proof of a truth worth carrying out of this story. In war, as in life, it is almost never the strongest machine that wins. It is the one that thinks and moves and works together faster than anyone believed possible.